Hello! Legends and canon have characters and stories from two different eras of Star Wars. What if Star Wars Legends and canon merged? What would become of the characters of each collection? Would the dark side reign supreme, or would the light come out on top? Special thanks to Artsabers for sponsoring our 75,000 subscriber lightsaber giveaway. All the details are in the pinned comment down below. We have only 1,000 more subscribers left until we hit that milestone. Our story begins in 15 ABY on the planet of Ossus. Luke Skywalker is the Grand Master of a new Jedi Order. He himself had no children, but his twin sister had 4 at this point. The first child was Ben Solo, born in 5 ABY. Jenna and Jason were born 4 years after, and of course Anakin in 10 ABY. Luke had a temple constructed here on Ossus, but no one was a part of his order. He'd been collecting artifacts and learning as much as he could about the Force and the ancient Jedi Order. There were texts from all around the galaxy, saved by the archivists and Jedi of the past. It was a really fascinating thing for him to do. During his journeys, he encountered a child by the name of Grogu, and he also befriended a man by the name of Kyle Katarn. Luke and Kyle were close, but not super close. At the moment, Kyle was on Ossus with Luke, checking out this order that Luke was building. Kyle had some input on it, but he was more so curious as to what Luke was doing. But Luke's calm demeanor towards it and his calm nature told Kyle that he was interested in growing his knowledge before attempting to fill the order with students. Ben Solo was interested in this Jedi Order, and he was currently 10 years old, which would have made him the same age as Anakin when he joined the Order. Luke at the moment didn't fear the idea of bringing Ben into his order. He didn't fear much. There was still a youthful optimism about him, even as he entered his 30s. Though there was someone after Luke. This individual had been ordered to hunt him. And he had no idea about this, obviously. At this point, the New Republic had finally been able to quell the rise of the Empire. There were still a couple of different Imperial factions out and about, but for the most part, the Empire had vanished. The largest group was the Empire of the Hand. While the war carried on, Luke spent time on his own, and even with other Force users, Leia being one of them, and Ahsoka another. Leia stopped her training amidst the pregnancy of what eventually became Jaina and Jason. When she picked back up, it was halted when Anakin was in her tummy. Leia afterwards didn't have much interest in learning the Force. She had no liking for her father, but Han suggested a helpful way of getting past that would be naming their final son after him. Maybe it would help, but it was an unknown factor until the boy was born. Leia couldn't hate her own child, so maybe it did work. Time would tell, though. Luke, on the other hand, after his sister's 3rd pregnancy, would return to his journey around the galaxy. Ossus's temple was already constructed, but he believed that there was much more he should uncover before he settled here on Ossus. After Kyle left, Luke went on his own journey, looking for a planet out in the galaxy with roots to the Jedi. He'd been to several of the commonly known ones, Tython, Jeddah, Coruscant, Ahch-To, and a number of other ones. This led Luke to traverse the northern portion of the galaxy, where he would find the planet of Megiddo. It had no roots to the Jedi, because he had no idea why he was here, but he was being called, and so he followed the Force and left. He'd been on his own for the most part since he last saw the Force ghosts at the Victory on Endor, teaching himself and following the Force through each point in his journey. Of course, the Jedi texts he found were a great source of knowledge, but he still had to instruct himself on how to do what they were teaching him to do. When he landed Red 5 on Megiddo's landing platforms, he and R2 got out of the vessel and began another new adventure. R2 had been with him through every adventure since the fall of the first Death Star. They were now inseparable. It was just beginning to snow, and Luke picked up on something vibrating in the Force. Unaware of what it could be, he continued forward. He knew that at some point the Jedi were here on Megiddo, but from what Luke understood, it was right before the Great Jedi Purge of the Clone Wars. The gentility of the snow took Luke's mind away from the Purge. When he got to the temple on Coruscant after the Empire fell, he was able to see security recordings of Order 66, and it haunted him. Seeing what his father did was menacing. He pushed those thoughts from his mind, seeing his boots etch outlines in the little bits of snow that were already stuck to the ground. The two of them made their way up to a large facility, clearly having been abandoned since the war decades before. When they entered the facility, it creaked and croaked. The sound of rust itching the steel beams tickled Luke's ears in an unpleasant manner. Luke stopped in his tracks, and the sound stopped as well. R2 bumped into his calf, and he stopped. Skywalker reached out to the Force, trying to find what it was he was looking for, and before he could really figure it out, a lightsaber ignited. He quickly ripped his emerald blade from his belt and pulled it in front of his face to defend himself. A woman with flowing red hair descended from the ceiling and smashed her blade against Luke's. The two of them split off and looked at each other, Luke putting space between him and the fiery woman. His biggest concern was making sure that R2 stayed alive, of course. The little droid got some space between himself and the two duelists. The woman explained that she was here specifically for the head of Luke Skywalker. Skywalker, and he accepted such a challenge, exclaiming that there would be no way for her masters to get it back. Their blades slammed together in the middle of the old industrial building. She was very highly trained, and Luke picked up on it quickly. She had the same ferocity as his father, but she was much lighter on her feet, and she fought with a reserved anger. He'd known of this anger before, and the one person it reminded him of was the same man who almost had Luke kill his own father. The two of their blades spread out, Luke holding his blade behind his back and staring down the woman. She addressed him as a fine duelist, but her master wanted him dead. Luke simply could not allow that, demanding to know who her master was. She didn't say another word, throwing herself at him and commencing another leg of a ferocious duel. Skywalker and Mara beat back at each other. The intense fight was more intense than even Luke was prepared to face from her. No matter, he would deal with this. While he was dueling with this woman, a man bolted out from a bundle of old pipes. R2 beeped at Luke and he saw the man. He was running with something in his hand, but Luke couldn't catch a good glimpse of what it was, as an amethyst blade punched his way in front of him. Luke told R2 to track down the man, and the droid went after him. Luke and the woman bashed at each other again, before Skywalker was able to thrust his blade forward, knocking her off her feet. She hissed at him as she hit the ground. Luke pointed his blade forward and demanded to know who she was. Mara looked at a means for escape. While she did, R2 was chasing down a man wearing a hood over his head, keeping his identity covered and hidden. The droid tried to catch him, but before he could, the man slid into a vessel and took off into the skies. R2 watched the ship fly away. Mara looked at Luke and told him that the Jedi would never have a chance to return, and then she saw Ochi's ship fly into the sky. He ditched her. Along with him being gone, it meant that her chances of returning to Exegol were extinguished. There wasn't a thought behind her eyes, and Luke could see it. He deignited his lightsaber, feeling a shift within her, but this didn't make her any less inclined to bring back his head to her master. Though when she reached for her blade, Skywalker slammed his boot down on the hilt of the lightsaber and shook his head, telling her that she would already have enough difficulty trying to get off the planet. He didn't have any intentions of making it any more difficult for her to do so. Before he released his boot, he told her that he pitied her for having been abandoned by whatever master she served. It wasn't a fair fate to deal with, but if she ever felt the call to the light, then maybe, just maybe, the mercy he showed her here would lead her to a life better than that she currently possessed. Luke removed his boot and turned around, meeting with R2 outside of the complex and walking back to Red 5. It was clear that what they had been looking for was gone, so there was no reason to stay. Luke's curiosity piqued over who that hooded man could be. The only Force wielder on Megiddo besides himself was that woman, and it was unlikely that a woman of her stature would be serving the will of a mere non-Force user, but who knows? On the planet of Trangilia, Ben Solo ran into a field outside the House of the Solos. Leia Organa was removed from being able to serve within the Senate of the newly formed New Republic because of her relation to Anakin Skywalker, which was a bit of a below-the-belt blow to her. She did all this work, lost her home, her family, because of a man she still resented. Her youngest boy, Anakin, did not share that same amount of resentment from his mother. But none of the kids, aside from Ben Solo, knew about Anakin Skywalker anyways. Ben was fascinated by his legacy, and especially by what his uncle Luke was doing, continuously being adamant about becoming a Jedi like his uncle and his grandfather before him. For Han, it was a little unnerving, but he trusted that Ben would be alright. Ben was told by Leia to not talk to Jason, Jera, or Anakin about their grandfather. He didn't understand why, and Leia never really explained it to Ben. So when Ben asked his father, he didn't respond with much deeper than it would be Leia's decision to give that information over to him, or just whenever she felt like it. Han respected the vulnerability that Leia had over the situation regarding what her biological father had done. She never wanted the name Skywalker, so she stuck with the name Organa. Ben didn't understand that either, despite what she'd mentioned about missing her homeworld of Alderaan. Chandrilia was the closest planet to Alderaan that Leia had ever been to. It resembled her home, and it made her long for her connection with her parents. She was only 19 when she lost both of them and her home world. Han to an extent understood. As a boy he was abandoned on Corellia, so all he knew was having to get through things by himself. However, at the very least he had Kira until she abandoned him for the Crimson Dawn, but by that time he already had Chewie. Family life on Trangilia was nice for the Solos. They were set for life because of Mon Mothma. She knew all the work that Leia did and believed that some things were indeed stronger than blood. Leia may have been Anakin's daughter, but the actions she made in her own life did not warrant her being removed from the New Republic. But people are always predictable, and they made sure that Leia could not touch the politics of a reforming galaxy, just in case that Vader came up in her. It did hurt Leia. She was always resilient, but all of her life's work was thrown back in her face because of a man she never wanted to come across again. Luke Skywalker, interested in finding this man from Megiddo, set off on a journey across the galaxy, searching for him. It led him all across the Mid-Rim and even through the Outer Rim, and yet it got him nowhere. After years of chasing, with no results, he returned to Ossus and settled down for a little, taking in his first student, 11-year-old Ben Solo. Luke's academy would fill up with nearly 12 students in the coming months. He wasn't done looking for the cloaked man, but he also wasn't going to try and chase a man who had no features Luke could see or recognize. When he felt called, he would try again. As for now, he would continue to work on his new academy and building it from the ground up. Luke's time spent inside of the Jedi texts for the longer part of the last 11 years had him going back to what the original Jedi were. His fascination with the mysticism of the Jedi led him down this path, and therefore he put it into the minds of his students, having taught himself the path of the Jedi aside from what was taught to him by Ben and Yoda. Luke found himself resorting back to a method from before the Old Republic, some 20,000-year-old teachings, but this did also include his own twist on the teaching. It's what led him to giving someone like Grogu the option to leave the Order. Skywalker's academy was full of talented students, but none was more talented than Ben Solo. The kid had a lot of potential and a lot of power. It was also ironic. Ben was a spitting image of Anakin Skywalker, which Luke assumed was something that probably bothered his sister. Luke was aware of Anakin's attempts to contact his daughter through the Force, but every time he came across her, she blew him off. She wanted nothing to do with him. It did lead Luke to try and wonder why the Jedi couldn't reach out to him. The Force Ghost, that is. But there was nothing for him to learn from them. Force Ghosts, as he learned, weren't able to reveal secrets in the Force. They could only give direction. So if there was something evil looming in the galaxy, they could suggest Luke to go out in a certain direction. However, they could not directly affect the will of the Force. Being as Yoda always said, the Force is always in motion. It left Luke to determine where his path should go, and what should become of this new Jedi Order. Luke noticed some things regarding his young student. Well, Ben was his oldest student, but he was still young. For about a year, he'd been acting off. This wasn't using the dark side, it was more so a fact that he seemed like there was a voice inside of his head calling out to him. This wasn't an evil voice, it was like crying, like an infant of sorts. Luke had been trying to read up on it, but some of the only solutions he had didn't really seem that feasible. Luke was especially concerned because of it, but over the coming years the voice stopped its crying and it was replaced by the voice of a small child. It was something peculiar, though that was the only thing Ben ever mentioned to Skywalker. Ben, when he was younger, was approached by an older man, someone who came to him as a friend. This man was someone Ben never thought to be of anyone bad, so he trusted this Snoke fellow. Ben trusted Snoke to an extent, but ever since his first meeting with Snoke, he was approached by other voices. These typically occurred when he was sleeping, in the form of dreams for the most part. None of it was ever a concern for Ben, so he just allowed them to flow through him and say what they wanted. Sometimes he would hear the voice of his grandfather. Other times it would be the distant voices of two other older men. One was a more recognizable Snoke, and the other one he couldn't put his finger on. Of course, because these voices were locked into Ben, they also became locked on to the small child elsewhere in the galaxy. While Luke's academy had grown, and his students had become formidable, he was still restless. He never slept well. Luke had a lot of unspoken trauma from the Death Star, too. What he saw, what he came across, the face of Palpatine often rose him from his slumber, and his cackling laugh echoed out in his ears daily. Luke never assumed to be that the evil Sith Lord was still alive, rather that the darkness inside the Death Star itself had such a negative effect on him that he couldn't actually escape it. As Luke was becoming mythologized himself, being regarded as more than just a man but a legend, he accepted that maybe the penance of having defeated the Sith, or at the very least assisted in their downfall, which Anakin was the chosen one, that he was left to deal with the shadow of the Sith, so that no one else had to. Luke in his own mind would rather be stuck with nightmares for the rest of his life than allow the galaxy to face the torture that could come from some evil Sith Lord. After 4 years of building an academy on Ossus with visiting teachers from time to time, Luke's niece and nephew would be joining this order. Over the past 4 years, Leia, Ahsoka, Ezra Bridger, and Kyle Katarn visited the academy. These periodic visits were typically not planned, and they were just people carrying on their journey. Luke had an interest in training Kanan Jarrus' and Hera Syndulla's son, Jacen Syndulla, but it seemed at this point that Jacen was hanging around with his mom and his older brother, in Ezra. Luke couldn't help but be happy for the little family the Ghost had. With Ezra back in their lives, they didn't want to let him go, so he stayed with them instead of Luke, which was fine. Ezra didn't know Luke like he did the others. Kyle, on the other hand, was a little bit more of a nomad, but he contributed to Luke gaining new members in the Jedi Order by bringing them to Ossus for him. From time to time when he wasn't doing work, he would pay them a visit and give a lesson or two, tell some cool stories, and then leave the next morning before any of the students woke up. Ahsoka would show up and mostly observe. She would from time to time say something inspirational here and there, notice similarities between Ben Solo and Anakin Skywalker, and maybe teach a lesson on balance and so forth, and similarly to Kyle, leave in the morning. Luke's sister, Leia, was trained enough to be a Jedi Master. She essentially was. but she never finished her training fully. She believed that finishing her training would tear her family apart, so she avoided finishing it. Han wasn't exactly the most excited about their children leaving home at the age of 10 to join Luke's academy, but he respected and accepted their decisions because, well, he loved them. Leia and Han would visit the temple with their 3 children to see Ben and Uncle Luke. Ben was always happy to see his parents. He adored his mother, but the relationship with his father was always a bit rocky. Han by no means was a bad or uncaring father, but some elements of who he was as an individual left Ben feeling without the full experience, if you will. Han cared and loved Ben as much as he did any of his other children, but the way in which he communicated his love and affection wasn't exactly the way that Ben always needed. Regardless, Leia would stay longer than Kyle or Ahsoka, but shorter than Ezra. She, Han, and their children would visit for about a week and then eventually leave. During the week, she would do what the others did, teach a number of lessons and spend time with her son before leaving. This most recent visit of Leia's would have both Jason and Jara, both now aged 11, joining Luke's academy, which both Leia and Han agreed was fine before they arrived. Luke was unaware of this decision, but he welcomed their choices to join the Order. Their youngest child, Anakin, wasn't yet all that interested in the idea of joining the Jedi. Though something that Luke needed to do came up, and when both Leia and Han arrived, he asked if they could maintain the Order for him. He and his oldest nephew were going on a mission together. Hennix, Ty, and Vo understood why the two of them were going off on their own mission, but sometimes they felt as if Luke favored his nephew more than he did his other students, which wasn't at all true. But Ben expressed a crazed vision. He saw a little girl screaming, and it woke him from his sleep, and she was being dragged away on a desert planet. Luke asked Ben if he knew which one, and he didn't. So, the two of them would go to Tatooine, Jedha, Pisana, and eventually find themselves on Jakku. Ben and his classmates Hennix, Ty, and Vo had all gone to Jedha with Luke before. It was a bit scary, but Luke believed it to be good for their training, to see a place where the Jedi once were. The crater left behind from the Death Star was menacing. Of course, the people who lived on Jedha that survived just built a city in the crater and called it home. Though, when Ben and Luke came here alone, they learned that it wasn't where the vision had happened. The screaming of the little girl haunted him, and it cried out to him every day and night. So they carried on, going from desert world to desert world, finding themselves on Pisana, which for Luke made him feel a little disturbance that he would later try and investigate, but not now. On Ossus, while Luke and Ben were gone, Ezra Bridger would stop by for one of his 2 to 3 week excursions. He was surprised when Luke wasn't there, but he was always happy to be around Leia and Han. Of course, Ezra knew Leia from their mission when he was just a boy, where Leia helped deliver the Hammerhead Corvettes to the rebels. He never forgot it, though that didn't amount to the shock he received when he learned that she and Luke were the children of Anakin Skywalker. He never understood how that was at all possible or how Kanan never knew about that. Regardless, the students on Ossus were being taken care of really well by both Leia and Ezra. Ben and Luke, on the other hand, had just arrived on Jakku. They were searching for whoever this Virgins in the Force was. They found themselves at a small junk town, and it was close to the Badlands of Jakku, not far away from where the beginning of the end of the Empire started. Luke remembered hearing the news about Jakku after the battle happened. He told stories about the war to Ben, the entire journey around the galaxy, but when they got closer to Jakku, Luke had so much more to say about it. When they landed, they walked through a small town, and they saw a big Kraloot man. He shoved a little girl to the ground after telling off a group of men. The Kraloot man could be audible. He told the girl that if she didn't learn how to fight for herself, then terrible things would happen to her. Both Ben and Luke saw the fear in her eyes. Ben tried to rush forward, but Luke stopped him. They needed to handle this situation delicately. There was some kind of bond here between the Kraloot man and this little girl. He was likely a caretaker, but it's clear aside from giving her what that little warning was, he didn't really care about her. He started walking away from the girl and shoved the 2 men who tried to grab her away. The little girl grabbed her leg and rubbed it. When she was grabbed by the 2 men, they dragged her across the sands, burning her legs. If it wasn't for Unkar Plutt, who knows what would have happened to her. What a good way to gaslight someone into believing they owed you something. Unkar clearly didn't care too much about her. He just liked the idea of having someone to do work for him. He was a junk trader in the town. He gave people food for giving him parts. This is something that Rey would soon learn. She would be forced to do work for her food. At the moment, the only way she earned food was by cleaning products in the back of the shop for Unkar. She wasn't even allowed to stay with him. She found herself a small home inside the wreckage of an AT-AT on the far side of town. She picked it because she hoped that she wouldn't be followed back by those nasty individuals who frequented her town. Luke and Ben started slowly approaching, but Luke told Ben to stay back and asked if this was the girl from his vision. He nodded his head, so Luke moved forward and gently approached her, asking if she was okay. She didn't like the idea of someone else approaching her, especially another older man, as she threw sand up at Luke towards his eyes. But with a gentle wave of his hand, the sand was stopped in midair and it dropped to the ground. He told her that he had no intentions of hurting her, pulling out a small cooling pad from his belt and telling her to put it on her legs. He handed it to her and she ripped it out of his hands. Luke sat down next to her, keeping his distance. He told her that he was a Jedi and asked if she had ever heard of them. She nodded her head, with a little excitement. The holo recordings and holo discs inside the AT-AT and even some of the Rebel tanks and starships had people talking about the return of the Jedi and Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker. She didn't realize she was talking to a mythologized legend. Luke didn't introduce himself, he just kept the conversation basic. He grabbed a small bottle that he had with him and he gave it to her, telling her that it was fresh water. She took it and drank it, almost drowning herself. It was cold water. One wouldn't understand what a culture shock this was for her. Cold water on Jakku was unheard of. She gulped it down and Luke tried to slow her before she hurt herself. She was just a kid though, she wouldn't know any better. Unkar came out of a series of tents like a bat out of hell, pointing his finger at Luke and telling him to get away from his worker. Rey looked at Unkar and jumped to her feet, darting behind Luke, who hadn't even moved from his seated position. Ben watched Luke from a distance and noticed the girl put herself behind Luke. The Jedi Master slowly got to his feet and Unkar towered over him, shoving his finger into Luke's chest a number of times, but Luke didn't budge, just looking it off and telling the man that he'd best leave him alone. But Unkar didn't. He was adamant on having a slave for the rest of his life. No one ever left Jakku, and what would be better than a girl who would see him as her only family? It would be great business for a good 20 to 30 years while she was in her prime. Luke looked at Unkar, who was demanding that Luke give Rey back to him. Luke shook his head and told Unkar that if Rey wanted to come with him to learn the way of the Force, then she was welcome. It was not Unkar's choice. He hissed and threw a punch, and Luke swiftly disarmed the man, twisting his wrist and using all of Unkar's own energy and flipped the man onto his back. Skywalker turned around and got down onto his knee and told Rey that he had no intention of hurting her, but he would train her if she wanted. In all honesty, Rey wanted to, but she was afraid her parents would come back for her, and if she wasn't here, then they would miss her. Luke already knew the truth. Her parents weren't coming back, and he could see it in Rey's eyes. She knew it too. Everything she faced in the first few months here on Jakku were terrible. Those two men who dragged her, it wasn't the first time that happened. The work she did, just to eat at the age of 5, was the only way she ever ate. The water she drank was nothing short of poison. She wanted to be free from Jakku, but hoped her parents would come back for her. She knew they wouldn't in her own heart, but didn't want to accept it in her own mind. She looked at the water in her left hand and then the cooling pad in her right, and she nodded her head. Afraid, but willing. Luke opened up his arms and picked her up, carrying her back to the small shuttle they arrived in. When they got in, Luke introduced her to Ben, and told Ben to get the ship going back to Ossus. Luke stayed with her and helped her nurse her pain. By the time they arrived on Ossus, Ben had acquainted himself with Rey, and Luke realized the two of them shared a bond not seen in generations, one very powerful and strong, a dyad in the Force. Luke once believed that he and Leia shared such a gift, but it was different. Siblings in the Force were typically powerful together anyways, but a dyad was like life itself, something similar to that of Anakin Skywalker, but instead of it being one person, it required two. Though there was something both Luke and Leia picked up on when it came to Rey. There was something dark about her, they couldn't figure it out, but that wasn't important as of now. Leia and Han spent an extra week with him before saying their goodbye to their 3 children and taking their son Anakin back to Tringilia. Anakin was unlike his other siblings. At such a young age, he was able to use the Force, perhaps even better than his siblings, but it didn't interest him. Anakin Solo was much more interested in his grandfather Bail Organa and in what Leia would have been doing had they not been related to Skywalker. Much unlike his siblings, Anakin had a great amount of resentment for the man he was named after. However, Leia and Han were never privy to this, and they would never become privy to it, as Anakin kept such things private in his own life. On Ossus, everything was cooling back down. Ezra finished his training regiment with the students and disappeared back to join up with his friends in the Ghost crew. Luke picked up where he left off and began training his students again, while at the same time welcoming 3 of his newest faces into the Order, Rey, Jarrah, and Jacen. These children, while being the youngest of the group, most specifically Rey, would likely be important for the continuous growth of the Jedi Order. Ben's anger had simmered down, and he was a bit more in control. This seemed to be the effect of what Luke had accepted as a dyad in the Force. However, Luke wasn't going to introduce the 2 of them to the concept of them being a dyad in the Force until Rey was around what Ben's current age was. The 10-year gap made it rather interesting for the Force to choose them as a dyad, but the Force worked in mysterious ways, and Luke believed that it was likely a reason for this. Though with his other half of the dyad here, Ben began to consult Luke about a man who had reached out to him several times, mostly through the Force, but they had an encounter on a planet of Jedha at one point or another when they had gone there on one of their trips. Luke asked why he was finally telling him about this, to which Ben explained that his mind was a little bit more clear and his thinking wasn't quite off kilter. Luke understood this to mean that likely Ben was being corrupted by this Snoke individual. Luke decided to take Ben out into a meadow during a normal training day alone. In the meadow, Luke asked if Ben would join him in a meditation. As Luke explained, he would use this trial meditation to establish what he could find out about this Snoke individual. They would essentially be making Ben vulnerable to any dark side users in the galaxy and welcome them. But Luke would be with his nephew the entire time and he wouldn't let anything bad happen to him. Ben trusted him and the meditation began. Luke's meditation closed himself off and focused specifically onto Ben and found that there was a voice calling out from a place in the galaxy. Then he realized there were two individual voices. Finally, a third. This confused Luke because he knew the third. It was his own father's voice. But how could that be? Luke dug deeper and found that one of the voices was sitting on a throne surrounded by red curtains. Luke peered through the curtains and then recognized the landscape of the planet. It started with a P, and then he exited the throne room and it was a planet of Primera. Luke would call upon his allies, Ezra, Kyle, Leia, and Ahsoka, and they would come with him. This would leave Han in an awkward position. He would simply be left on Ossus with a bunch of Jedi, and he'd try to teach them something. Maybe he'd teach them how to shoot first. Yeah, that's what I'll start with. The Jedi, on the other hand, mounted up together, a force to be reckoned with, and taking their Jedi shuttle, they departed for Primera. There was a small defense fleet, but it wasn't anything larger than 2 Imperial Star Destroyers and a larger version of a Star Destroyer, which would be a Resurgent class destroyer. The ship slid past the defense fleet and made its way to the ground. A massive palace sat up on a mountain range. Chances are that there were anti-air weaponry, and so they set the ship down outside the mountain range and prepared their move. Ahsoka was the oldest one here, and so she took point, having done an operation similar at the Citadel when she was younger. The Jedi moved in together, quickly. All of them still relatively in their primes. They moved into the facility trying to avoid setting off any alarms. The halls were filled with dark troopers, variants that Luke had disabled on Moff Gideon's starship years before. They didn't need to alert the dark avatar to their presence. When they eventually made it to the throne room, they all ignited their weapons. The doors opened and they walked into the room. There were a number of guards standing silently. They turned their attention but didn't move. The man on the throne simply smiled and welcomed his guests. The Jedi started forward and stopped when Snoke stood up. He was very tall and lengthy, but also old and fragile. Snoke had them exactly where he wanted them. They stood over a small chasm, and with a snap of his finger, the bridge snapped, dropping the 5 Jedi. The twins darted out of the way, but not fast enough. Ezra and Kyle were thrown backwards, and Ahsoka thrown forward. She looked up, and she was at the feet of Snoke. He grinned, calling her by her full name, and suggesting that there was already a pre-established connection between the two of them. Which there certainly wasn't. Ahsoka got to her feet and ignited her lightsabers. Snoke just smiled and raised his hand, and the Praetorian Guard jumped into action. In the chasm, where the bridge fell, Leia was knocked out and Luke jolted up. He was for a moment, but he came to. The bridge was slipping, but steady for a current moment. They had to get out of here. Luke looked up around, seeing if he could do something. Ezra peered over and asked Luke if they were alright. He nodded his head, and they were. Luke told Ezra that he would lift Leia up to him and then they could get her out of the situation first. Ezra was on board, and he reached out his hand. Luke lifted Leia up. On the other side of the chasm, Ahsoka was thrown back, trying to hold her own against the 8 Praetorian guards. They were trained for combat like this. Ahsoka was highly trained and talented though. She would certainly make it out of this, slicing one of the guards down. Kyle looked down and saw Leia being lifted up and prepared to jump forward when the door behind him boomed open. A number of Praetorian guards piled out. He ignited his own lightsaber to block them, but there were far too many of them, and they pushed him back. Ezra saw this, but he couldn't drop Leia. She was in his grip now. Luke slowly stood up, preparing his ascent, when he heard Ezra cry out in pain, as he was thrown over the edge, barely grasping a railing while still holding Leia in his grip. Luke had to get up there. He could see Kyle struggling on the other side, and so was Ahsoka. Luke propelled himself up, jumping from side to side of the chasm, getting to the top and igniting his lightsaber and engaging the guards. This gave Ezra time to lift Leia up and place her on the platform. He then hoisted himself up, grabbing his calf. There was a hole in it. He was stabbed really badly before almost falling to his death. He limped up and grabbed his lightsaber, igniting the blade, joining the fight against the guards. Kyle was able to dispatch 2 of the guards he was fighting against, and jumped across the chasm to assist Ahsoka. She'd gotten them down to 6 members, but she was still struggling. A cut sliced into her arm. With Kyle there, the 2 of them divided up the Praetorians, taking 3 on at a time. Ezra and Luke worked together, dispatching the other 3 guards before Luke jumped across the chasm and joined Kyle and Ahsoka. Ezra, on the other hand, deignited his weapon and slid down next to Leia and made sure she was alright. She was. The 3 Jedi were able to work together. With 3 of them, it was much easier to take on the Praetorian guards, and once they were done with, they challenged Snoke. But Snoke was no fighter. He was just simply a mind, so when the 3 of them jabbed his body with their lightsabers, he simply died. It almost felt too easy, as if something was missing, but it was clear Snoke was dead. When the Jedi eventually returned to Ossus, they split back up, going back into their own directions, as Luke picked up right where he left off. And while it seemed like Snoke was gone, there was something troubling the Grand Master. These nightmares that he'd been having only continued to get worse. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Jack Miller, Apollo, Jedi Sloth, Mad Maddie Studios, Anakin003, Lemon Knight, Flynn Bassis, Rex the Wolf, the man with 3 first names, Dark Saint 46, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button if you want to see more. If you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon. Anyways, this is just a concept video. I don't really have any intention of going any further with it, but if you guys enjoyed it, then I will. Like I said, just really a concept video, just a concept that I was just trying out. And if you guys like it, then we'll continue doing it. Anyways, that's all I have to say. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.